All right, so now we're into the Week 10 recap. Week 10 bundles well with Week 9, or it segues nicely from Week 9 to Week 10, because in Week 9 we broached the topic of free will with regard to sort of trying to resolve the problem of evil. And one thing that I said in the presentation for Week 9 is that the free will defense could be somewhat problematic because it assumes that there is free will. And that, of course, is an issue of no small contention in the history of philosophy. So in Week 10, we look into the possibility of free will, what it would look like if we had free will, so on and so forth. And so what we looked at here were a larger number of arguments than usual, at least a larger number of independent active reading type arguments. In the presentation, what we looked at were these ideas of free will and moral responsibility primarily, or free will and responsibility for our actions, generally speaking. So we started off with a very simple argument which says if we are morally responsible, then we have free will. We are morally responsible, therefore we have free will. So this is the argument for moral responsibility, which sort of says that the only way in which we could be responsible for our actions in a sort of moral way was to be if we freely choose them in some sense, if they are up to us. And of course, as far as our practices, social, political, whatever practices go, we're holding ourselves and each other morally responsible all the time. And so, given this observation that we are morally responsible, well then it must be the case that we are free, because otherwise we couldn't be morally responsible. Now, of course, this is very vague. The sense in which our actions are up to us is not well defined, and there's also the problem about whether this argument begs the question in some sense, because this idea that we are morally responsible is based on our observations of what we actually do. But of course, if we were unfree, we would still go around, if we didn't have free will, we would still go around doing the exact same things that we do. And that's the sort of heart of the problem with a lot of adjudicating between these arguments. It's hard to observe our freedom. The idea being that we would do exactly the same things if we weren't free, it would just be that they were determined. So we would still go around charging people with murder and putting them in jail and chastising our friends and acquaintances when they did things that we thought were wrong. We would still do that if we lacked free will. In fact, we wouldn't be able to help but do it. So the mere fact of our practices doesn't establish our genuine moral responsibility. So there might be something a little difficult, a little invalid even about this argument. So to try and resolve this, we need to get a better idea of what our actions being up to us means. And so we turn to this principle of alternative possibilities that says an action is up to you when you could have done otherwise. So it's this phrase, could have done otherwise, which is incredibly important in sort of contemporary discussion of free will. What does it take to be able to do otherwise, and how is that related to free will? So, on the assumption that the ability to do otherwise is what it means to be morally responsible, then we can transform the original argument from if we are morally responsible if we have the ability. No. Yeah, sorry. It's basically if we have the ability to do otherwise, we are free. And if we're not, then we're not free. And so this kind of brings into focus the distinctions between, on the one hand, determinism and indeterminism, and on the other hand, compatibilism and incompatibilism. Determinism and indeterminism are sort of metaphysical statements about the way the universe works. Determinism, which is the one that we primarily focus on in this section, is the idea that all of our actions are determined, not just all of our actions, all facts, all events in the universe are determined by the events that came before them and the laws of the universe, right? So the fact that I wore this green pullover thing is determined by certain things like it being cold and my liking the color green, and my liking the color green is determined by blah, 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 blah. There's an explanation which stretches all the way back to the beginning of time. And that's what Inwagen's consequence argument talks about, saying that any action in the present, and this is particularly human actions, has an explanation which goes back to, has a causal chain, a causal explanation which goes back to the beginning of the universe. And given that it goes back that far, there's a sense in which, and this is what the fatalism article was about, everything that we do, we were always going to have done that. That is, when the universe began, the statement, Evan Blutz will wear a green pullover on Saturday, December 9th, 2017, that statement was already true at the beginning of time, right? So that's what's going on in the fatalism argument. They're talking about the truth values of statements being fixed before they happen. So statements about the future are true already now in the present, and were true already then in the past. That's the argument that fatalism is trying to make. So this consequence argument sort of feeds into this fatalism argument very clearly. What does this have to do with compatibilism and incompatibilism? Well, the sort of consequence argument in fatalism, because they say that the things are deterministic, they're saying that free will and determinism are incompatible. That is, because when your actions are determined, there is no apparent sense in which you could have done other than you do. So if determinism is true, I couldn't have worn a black hoodie instead of this green pullover. I could not have done anything but wear this green pullover. Then my choice to wear it was not free, right? That's what incompatibilism says. If you can't do otherwise, incompatibilism says that free will is incompatible with determinism because determinism means you didn't have the ability to do otherwise, right? So compatibilism, on the other hand, would say that free will is compatible with determinism. How would that work? Well, this is where the Frankfurt argument about the refutation of the principle of alternative possibilities comes into play. Frankfurt says that you don't need to be able to have done otherwise in order to be morally responsible for something, in order for it to be sort of, in order for us to be morally responsible for it, and then on the assumption that moral responsibility entails the existence of free will, it looks like that we can be morally responsible and hence free, even if determinism is true, even if we couldn't have done otherwise. And so Frankfurt's argument says that, or uses examples like mind control examples, where the situation is such that, let's say you're thinking about robbing a bank. If you decide to rob the bank, then you will have done it on the basis of your own desires and decisions, and you'll be morally responsible for it. On the other hand, if you decided, oh, I'm not going to rob a bank, then the situation in the Frankfurt cases is such that some evil neuroscientist or demon or wizard is going to change your mind, right? They're going to use their magic or their brain implant device, and they're going to change your desires so that if you don't choose to rob the bank, you're going to rob the bank anyway, right? So this situation paints it in such a way that you couldn't have done otherwise. No matter what, you're going to rob the bank. However, Frankfurt says there is obviously a difference in moral culpability. When the bank robbing is a result of your own sort of naturally arising desires and plans and so forth, then you're morally responsible. When you're robbing the bank arises from the sort of unnatural chain of events involving magic and brain control devices, then you are not responsible. So there is a difference in moral responsibility, even though there is no difference in what actually happens, right? So that's the Frankfurt argument. And so even though we don't have the ability to do otherwise in this bank robbing case, we are still morally responsible. And if moral responsibility, regardless of how it comes about, entails free will, then the Frankfurt cases might preserve for us the idea that we have free will. That's a might, right? So it's not clear, but it sort of leaves room for a compatibilist view. So we sort of discussed 3 of the 4 articles that were up for week 10. The 4th one is Jean-Paul Sartre's argument about sort of radical freedom. And his idea about radical freedom is that human beings are sort of unavoidably free, right? In fact, Sartre talks about human freedom as we're sort of cursed with freedom, right? It's this burden that we bear. So Sartre is an existentialist philosopher, sort of French or Swiss existentialist philosopher. And existentialism generally, a very brief overview would be, it says there is no sort of ordained meaning and purpose to life. The purpose and meaning is sort of based on our own decisions and valuations. So Sartre's argument here is much like you can think back on the zombie argument from Chalmers, or the what it's like to be a bad argument. It says, look, all this physical causal stuff, that's true, right? It's true that brain electrochemical states sort of lead to certain behaviors, so on and so forth. But those aren't the reasons that we do things. So there's a distinction drawn between the world of causes, the physical stuff, and the world of reasons, the possibly non-physical stuff. Sartre says that, in the last accounting, what the reason why we do, what makes us and motivates us to do things are meanings. And purely causal descriptions of things don't have meanings, right? So if meaning is the thing that makes us do stuff, and that's not physical, then it's not in the realm of being determined, right? Meaning is not determined. So the fact that green means go was not determined at the beginning of time, or at least that's the argument that Sartre is trying to make. And given that it's meaning that causes meaning that explains actions, then we are sort of free from this idea of determinism. Literally, we're free from it because our actions are not stuck, bogged down in this physical world of causes, but are up in this non-physical world of reasons. Sartre's argument is a bit complicated, and I'm not doing it justice entirely here, but that's the sort of general way to think about it. And I think it is profitable to consider it in light of the anti-physicalist arguments that we looked at a couple weeks before. So again, hopefully this has been interesting and helpful to you, and this was sort of one of the more lengthy sections because there were more readings than usual, and hopefully you can now see how they're all connected.